So here's we start Unit 6. We're going to need to go back and recap what exactly we've been talking about as we've studied macroeconomics. So at the start of Unit 4, we had this textbook definition of macroeconomics, and we said that it's the study of the structure and performance of national economies and of the policies that governments use to try to affect economic performance. And we really focused in on this idea of performance of national economies. And we said we use some data points in order to measure that performance. We talked about GDP, inflation, and unemployment. But in this unit, what we want to do is take this idea of performance of national economies and put it on an economic model. And then once we put it on an economic model, we're going to try to understand how specific policies that governments put in place affect that performance. And so we're going to be kind of looking at this entire definition as a whole. Now, again, we said within macroeconomics, we are attempting to study not just a single market, but we want to look at the entire economy, or what we might call the aggregate economy. Aggregate really just means total. And we had said in microeconomics, we used our basic supply and demand model in order to understand the market for a single good. But in macroeconomics instead, since we want to study the entire economy, we're going to use what we call the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand, or what we may say the total supply and the total demand, to understand the total economy. So let's review these models. Remember, we said our microeconomic model back from Unit 2. We had our quantity on our x-axis and our price on our y-axis. And so we have our demand curve that was downward sloping, our supply that was upward sloping, and then we had our equilibrium, that point where the quantity demanded was equal to the quantity supplied. And so maybe this is the supply and demand for a pair of socks. And you can see that at a price of $10, the amount of those socks that are supplied is equal to the amount of those socks that are demanded. Now, this is just for a single market, just for a single product. In macroeconomics, when we want to study the entire economy, we're going to have to make some changes to our supply and demand model. So what we're going to do is we're going to change some of these axes and some of the labels of our different curves. And so first and foremost, on our x-axis, instead of quantity, since we're not just looking at the amount of a single product, we're looking at all products, we're going to use our real GDP. Because we said our real GDP shows us the total amount of everything we produce in our economy. And like we said, we can't just use a regular old number of items in order to put that there, because the number of items doesn't really matter. If I was to say that my economy produced 10 of a product, well, how productive is that? Was it 10 pencils or 10 airplanes? There's a big difference there. And so what we do instead is we take the value of the amount of things that we make. And that's why we put our real GDP along our x-axis. And because those prices vary from all those items, whether it's pencils or airplanes, whatever we're making, we can't just put a dollar amount to a price on our y-axis. So instead we use those price levels. We had specifically talked a lot about the CPI as a price level that gives us the average level of prices over time and show how that changes over time. We are still going to have our supply and our demand curves, but our demand isn't just going to be our demand for a single product. It's going to be for all products. And so we're going to call that our aggregate demand curve. And then we're also going to have our aggregate supply curve. And then finally, we're going to have an equilibrium. But this equilibrium is a little different because it's not showing us the quantity and the price, but it's showing the total dollar amount, or the real GDP, and the price level, or maybe in our case, maybe the CPI. And so as we go throughout this unit, we're going to be using this model a whole ton. But you're already familiar with most of the concepts from talking about supply and demand way back in Unit 2. We're just going to show how it's a little bit different and we need to change our thinking just a little bit as we approach this model.